Good afternoon. I am delighted to be here today to talk to you about what is happening in the world of board directors and how you can best prepare yourself for serving on boards. My name is Julie Norris. Delighted that the Harvard Alumni Association has invited me to spend the hour with you, and I hope you enjoy the talk today. I am a senior client partner with Korn Ferry. It's a global search firm. I graduated from Harvard College in '89 and then did both a law and business degree here as well. I have spent the past 12 years recruiting board directors, and I'm very passionate about what I do and what I'll be talking to you about today, which is really helping the next generation of board directors find their way onto corporate boards. I've completed more than 100 corporate director searches. The companies I work with range from privately held companies or family-owned businesses to some of the largest global companies, Fortune 500, FTSE 100. We will typically work with a company that needs to recruit a single director because another director on the board is retiring. We would call that a single search. Or if the entire board has to be rebuilt, either because a company's emerging from Chapter 11 or spinning off a part of the company into an independent company, or through an initial public offering or IPO. Our clients and candidates span the globe, and we work with companies across all continents and candidates who could serve on the boards of companies in different continents. And I can see from the list of folks attending that we've got representation from many countries and many parts of the US. There's someone from El Salvador, New York City, some would call that its own country. On the West Coast, San Francisco, another country. So some really great people here, and we're thrilled that everyone's been able to join today. So there are 5 things that I'll talk about today. First, we'll talk about market demand and what it really looks like for people who are considering serving on boards today. The specific backgrounds of what boards are looking for in new directors. Talk about some examples of folks who've joined boards recently, what they look like in real flesh, the process that boards use to recruit a new director and how that's different from an executive search, because there are a few important differences. And then lastly, what you can do to best position yourself for boards. So to set the context, in today's world, rapid change is the new normal. And this is all the case because of what's happening with technology. A few stats to just set the stage. Facebook now has 2 billion users. That alone would make it the largest country. When Facebook went public 5 years ago, people thought it would be incredible if it could reach $100 billion market value, which it did when it went public. 5 years later, Facebook is valued at more than $500 billion. YouTube. Today, more than 5 billion YouTube videos are watched every day. Half of those are being watched on mobile devices, and an average viewing time of 40 minutes. That, to me, is mind-blowing. But the reality of it is, these technology changes are not just impacting technology companies, they're impacting all companies. And that is having an effect on our boardrooms. And an important tipping point, I think, was in 2012, Walmart, the largest retailer with $450 billion in revenue, elected a 36-year-old VP at Google to its board. That was Marissa Mayer. A few months later, she was named the CEO of Yahoo. That was a big step for a company like Walmart at that time. And it was a real turning point. And since then, many other companies have followed suit. Okay, so this is about a little historical context here to set the stage for what the actual demand looks like. In 2002, something called the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed, and that required that boards, public company boards in the US, have a majority of independent directors. So that would be directors who weren't working at or related to the company. The requirement is for a majority. The reality is that there's a super majority of directors who are independent on every board. So typically, most boards have somewhere between 8 and 10 directors, and typically today, only one, the CEO, is an insider. That means the other 7 to 9 directors are all independent directors who come from outside the company. The leadership of the board is also more independent than it used to be. Now, about 50% of boards have separated the CEO and the chairman roles. Historically, the CEO was also the chairman of the company, but in the wake of Sarbanes-Oxley, companies have elected to separate those roles. There are 3 required board committees for publicly listed companies in the US. Those are audit, compensation, and nominating and governance. Those committees must be staffed entirely with independent directors. So how much time does it take to serve on a board? Well, these days it's 200 hours plus per year that directors are spending serving on the board of a public company. And that includes travel time to and from meetings, preparation for the meetings, and the meetings themselves. Typically, boards have 4 to 6 board meetings a year in person. There are also additional committee meetings and telephonic meetings that will happen between the more formal board meetings. As a result of this time commitment, many companies are limiting the number of boards that their employees or executives can serve on. So it used to be that sitting CEOs of S&P 500 companies all served on at least 1 board outside of their own. Some even served on 2. Today, less than half of the S&P 500 CEOs are even serving on 1 board outside of their own. This has, by the way, cleared room for people other than CEOs to serve on the boards of these companies. Directors are getting older. There are nearly 7,000 public company directors who are over 70 years old. And boards today have put in place retirement ages. And the retirement ages are typically between 72 and 75. So at some point over the next 5 years, we would expect about 7,000 public company directors to retire, making room for the next generation. Lastly, in Europe, a number of countries have put in place actual quotas mandating gender diversity. Norway was the first mover, requiring that its boards have at least 40% of its directors be women. Other countries have followed suit, and then some countries who have not put in quotas are still very serious about looking at diversity. And I think the European quotas have shown a spotlight on this and caused other countries to really think about it. And in the US, where there are no quotas, there has been a lot of work done to demonstrate that having more women on boards actually improves the performance of those companies. And you can see here, companies like McKinsey or the Conference Board, Wellesley College have all done surveys that you can take a look at that demonstrate that there's a correlation. When there are more women on the board, the financial performance of the company is better. Investors are getting involved in this discussion. State Street Global Advisors, which is one of the world's largest asset managers managing mutual funds on behalf of companies and institutions, in March of this year made an announcement that they were going to vote against directors who don't take steps to bring more women onto their boards. And let me just unpack that a little bit for you. So as I mentioned before, there are 3 required committees: audit, compensation, and nominating and governance. It's the nominating and governance committee that helps determine who's going to serve on the board next. They're the ones that help run the process of the search for the next board director. So they essentially are the group that should be thinking about the diversity of the board, whether it's gender diversity or age diversity or diversity of perspective or background. That's the group that's typically tasked to look at that. So State Street essentially said, if you don't have women on your boards, we're going to look really closely because we want to understand why you don't have them there, particularly in light of the data that now shows it's really good for business. And State Street, in addition to making this announcement, had this statue. You can only see the back of the statue here. It's the Fearless Girl statue. Many of you may have seen it in March. It was all over social media. It's across from the bull on Wall Street, signifying the importance of women in leadership to the strength of our economy. Really exceptional play and reception for this statute. But just to underscore how important State Street, one of the largest investors, believed that having women on the boards was. And as a result, State Street has voted against directors who serve on those committees for the boards where women are continued to be lacking. CalPERS, which is the largest U.S. public pension fund representing public employees in the state of California, has done something similar. Their action was really a letter-writing campaign. So what they've done is sent letters to the chairs of the boards of roughly 500 U.S. public companies that still have no women, asking them to explain why there are no women and what they are doing to address this. And CalPERS, like State Street, will withhold votes if the issue of gender diversity is not addressed. Okay, that was a lot of context. Now we can get into the real meat of the discussion, which is what are boards looking for today? So this kind of goes back to where we started about technology and how that's so critical for what boards are thinking about they want in the boardroom. But there are a lot of other things that are still highly relevant as well. Boards are looking for people who can bring general management and relevant industry expertise. If it's a retail company and one of the board directors who is retiring has retail experience, they may be looking for another retailer to replace that director. Financial expertise is really important. Remember, the audit committee is one of the required committees. That committee is typically staffed by people who have been CFOs or perhaps retired audit firm partners, but really people who can bring financial expertise to the board to help evaluate and be able to weigh in on financial decisions being made in the company from the board's perspective. Insights into new customers and channels, as well as technology leadership. Again, this is the, how are our customers using social media to engage with our product? Well, the folks who've been sitting in this room for the past 20 years really don't have the firsthand insight into that someone like the 36-year-old VP at Google would have. And that's that's an area of major interest for most boards today. For companies that are highly regulated, bringing someone onto the board who is connected with the regulatory framework for that industry is often a priority. International market experience also matters. For companies who are increasingly growing in markets outside of the US, they look around the table, everyone in the room is from the US, they know they're missing what it means to build a business in Europe or in the Middle East, and will often look to bring a director on who can bring that into the room. And then diversity. We've talked a lot about gender, but diversity takes all sizes and shapes. Ethnicity and age are also factors to consider. Now the data, okay? So what this chart does is start to talk a little bit about the actual market for public company board directors. So we took a look at the roughly 4,000 public companies in the US and the directors that serve on them. And in that sample, there's about 28,000 individual directors. Of that 28,000 directors serving on the boards of US public companies, you'll see here that 13% of them are women. And again, the nearly 7,000 who are over 70. We then took a look more closely at those companies themselves, the 4,000 companies in the sample, 3,908 to be exact, as you see on this chart. Within that group of nearly 4,000 companies, 35% have no women. That's about 1,300 companies with no women board directors, another 30% that have only one woman, and then, perhaps it's surprising, 5% or about 200 companies that have 4 women or more. So clearly a wide variation in the representation of women on the boards of these public companies. This slide dives down deeper into that blue chunk from the last slide, the one that showed the 35% of companies, or roughly 1,300 companies, that have no women. And what this shows you is that there are no women on the boards of companies across sectors. So for example, there are 362 industrial companies that still have no women on their boards. There are 137 consumer companies still with no women. And then technology in the middle there with 295 companies, still no women. This is just meant to give you a little bit of a flavor for some of the boards that might be surprising to you, that they still have no women on the boards. And then this is a slide that shows you some of those companies amongst the 200 that have at least 4 women on their boards. Lots of very well-known, highly regarded companies here with a very large percentage of women serving on the board. Okay, another deep dive. So this slide shows you the directors who joined the Fortune 1000 last year. So the Fortune 1000 are essentially the largest 1,000 companies in our 4,000 companies sample, so the largest by revenue. And last year, about 830 or so new directors joined the boards of those companies. So you can kind of think of it as, you know, more or less one person, a little bit less than one person per board. So let's say each board, or 800 of the boards, replaced a director last year. This slide shows you the backgrounds of the people that joined boards last year. 26% of them were women, and the age distribution cuts across every age category. So roughly 50% in the 50 to 60 age range, but as you can see, folks joined boards who were under 40 as well as over 70. So a lot of interest in bringing the right people into the room, and age is one factor, but a lot of variation around what's happening. Another deeper dive. Now this slide shows you the background of only the women who joined boards last year. So remember, of the 830 new directors, we said 26% of them were women. This slide shows you the backgrounds of those roughly 220 women who joined boards of Fortune 1000 companies last year. So what's interesting is that crimson circle on the right side of the graph, which shows you that roughly 35% of the new women directors were running divisions or regions for their companies. So they weren't the CEO. They are not the senior most business leader of the company. They're typically a level down from the CEO, sometimes 2 levels down. And that's a really interesting trend, which goes to what we talked about earlier, the amount of time required to serve on boards, the fact that sitting S&P 500 CEOs are serving on fewer boards has really positioned an opportunity for folks below the CEO to have access into the boardroom. Functional heads represent another large percentage of folks who are serving on boards. This can include chief marketing officers, chief technology officers, folks who are running a division, as well as still CEOs are always in demand. Roughly 14% of the women who joined boards last year were the CEO or COO or chairman. I noticed that we're getting some questions. So one of the questions that's come in is, you know, how do we position ourselves to be noticed or recruited? So we'll talk more about this towards the end, but I think the way to think about this is in a pyramid, okay? And the bottom of the pyramid is really about excelling in your day job, okay? You gotta be really great at what you do in your company day to day. And once you feel that level of competence, then you wanna sort of get to be known outside of your company for what it is you're great at. It's a little bit of self-marketing. You could speak at a conference, you could write an article, you could sort of start to connect yourself on a broader scale about the things that you're great at so that people start to know who you are. And then lastly, the very top of the pyramid, and we'll talk a lot more about this, there is no substitute for networking. And that's perhaps an overused word, but I use it to mean for getting out there and letting people know who you are, what your value proposition might be to their board or their opportunity, and that serving on a board is something that you're interested in. Okay? Okay, so now, as I mentioned earlier, we are going to talk a little bit about some of the people who've actually joined boards in the past couple years to give you a flavor for what these people actually look like. So this is a list of number of women who've joined boards in the past couple years. Some of them have joined their first board. Others joined a board last year, but had already been serving on boards before then. I'm just going to highlight a few. Marla Beck is a Harvard Kennedy School and Business School alum. She was the founder and CEO of a company called Blue Mercury, which is a luxury beauty retailer. Bluemercury was acquired by Macy's a few years ago. Marla continues to serve as its CEO and of the Bluemercury Group. And Marla joined the board of the Children's Place, which is a specialty child's clothing retailer. So she serves on the board of the Children's Place and continues to be the CEO of Bluemercury. Jane DeFlorio is an example of someone with a finance background who used to be an investment banker. She retired from being an investment banker where she had covered the retail and consumer sectors, and she joined the board of DDR Corporation. DDR is a real estate investment trust, and they wanted to bring someone onto their board who really understood what was happening in the retail ecosystem and the evolution of omni-channel activity that was happening in that system. And Jane brought expertise in that area. Nadia Shorabora is a former senior Amazon executive who recently joined the board of Ferguson PLC. Ferguson is a global company that makes appliances, a distributor of appliances for plumbing and kitchens. And Nadia joined their board because they were looking for someone who really understood technology, who could help them anticipate what's happening in the world, how consumers are buying things differently, both online and in person. So bringing someone in the room who has that perspective was highly relevant. Okay, we'll keep going. So how does this happen? What do boards do to actually recruit board members? How do they find them? Well, one channel, and it's only one channel, is to use a search firm, and that's what my firm, Korn Ferry, does. There are other firms out there that do that. But there are a lot of other ways that this happens, and I wanted to make sure that you're all aware of them. Another way that this happens is from suggestions from existing board members. So typically, when a board recognizes that someone is about to retire or will be retiring, they ask other folks on the board to suggest people who might have the skills or experiences that the board's looking for to be able to join the board going forward. And by the way, these channels are not exclusive. If we're working on a search as a search firm, we will welcome suggestions from existing board members or any other avenue, because what we're all trying to do is find the best people to serve on the board going forward. Another channel is executives in the C-suite. So typically in a board search, even though the management isn't really involved day-to-day in the search, suggestions will come in from people who really understand what the company's about and may have access or insight into folks outside of the company who could be really valuable in the board of that company. Investors are another channel. This can include shareholders, private equity firms, venture capitalists, people who are always meeting new people who might bring value to a board. Advisors, or I sometimes call these people connectors. So these are consultants or people from accounting, law firms, consulting firms who really have a first-line access into great talent leading businesses around the globe and can provide suggestions into the boardroom. And then lastly, in the event of a merger, if one company buys another company, then typically some membership from the acquired company's board may continue on the board of the company that bought them. Okay, so whether a company is using a search firm or doing a search on their own, typically the company will do something, create a board matrix that looks something like this. We call this a skills matrix, and companies use it to really do what we would call a gap analysis. So essentially, they're trying to figure out where's the white space in what we're looking for, and then let's recruit to fill that white space. So in this example, the names of the directors that are serving on the board today would go on the left side of the page, and then the board would fill in the boxes, okay? They would take an inventory of what are the ages we have represented, are there women on the board, do we have ethnic diversity on the board, how many CEOs, former CEOs or active CEOs are actually serving on our board. And most boards like to have somebody, as I mentioned earlier, who has general management experience or who's run a business. Sometimes they like to have someone who's been the CEO of another company. That person can often serve as a mentor to the CEO of this company, or at least someone who's a fellow traveler walking through the same things in their own company. but on the board of this company and being able to provide advice to the CEO. And then there are a set of characteristics that we would call their professional background. And these are some of the experiences we talked about earlier. So, who on the board brings financial expertise, operational experience, technology, marketing. This varies by company, whatever the priorities are for that company or what goes on this matrix, and it gets filled in. And then again, if you see a column that's empty, like technology may have been for Walmart, for example, in 2012, that's when you decide, wow, this is a lot of white space, technology is really important for our business, time for us to find a director who can help solve that white space. One other characteristic here, on the far right, I listed a column called board experience. So sometimes companies want to bring somebody onto the board who has served on another public company board before. That often happens if the person retiring was a real governance expert. They want to replace that with someone else who knows something about governance. Sometimes it's not a requirement at all. Okay, I see that we're getting another question. Is it helpful to join boards of smaller organizations to work up to boards of larger organizations? That's a great question. And I think the answer is yes. If you have an opportunity to join the board of a public company, but it's a small public company, as long as all of the other factors check out, and we'll talk a little bit more around that at the end, what are the things you need to be thinking about from a due diligence perspective, I don't think size should be a guiding factor. And you should be willing and open to opportunities to serve on the boards of smaller companies as a way to get comfortable and familiar with what it takes to be a board director. And yes, I do think that will open up doors for larger companies later. Another question about nonprofits. What about nonprofits? So I get this question a lot. And there's obviously a lot of value to serving on the board of a nonprofit company, particularly if it's a nonprofit that you feel strongly about the mission. And frankly, I think that should be your real guiding factor if you want to join the board of a nonprofit. Is this something that you feel passionate about? In terms of whether or not public company boards view nonprofit board experience as relevant in their consideration of a potential candidate for their board, I think the answer is a bit varied. Typically, if they're looking for someone who has board experience to check the box on this chart, they're really looking for someone with public company board experience. So serving on the board of a nonprofit doesn't necessarily check that box. However, what it does do is a couple of things. One, depending on the nature of the nonprofit, some nonprofits, for example, large hospitals or health systems, they operate very similarly to corporate boards. And the people on the board will understand that, and your ability to explain how you've participated on the board of a nonprofit that has a governance structure that looks more like a public company will enable you to communicate that you know something about governance. Additionally, the network of relationships that you can build within the board of a nonprofit is an important consideration, because often other directors on the board of the nonprofit will be serving on public company boards, maybe CEOs of public companies, and that will give you visibility to people who may become connectors or create opportunities for you in a public board setting later on. Okay, next slide. So what does the process look like? So this is a picture of what an executive search director process looks like, or a search being led by a search firm. Typically, it's a 3 to 4 month process. There are 5 stages. I'll talk a little bit about this, but you can all have access to this later. And by the way, these slides would be available to anybody who wants them, so no worries about that. So the first phase is really what we would call discovery and alignment. And that's when we spend a lot of time up front getting the spec right, the specification. And that's where we speak with all of the members of the Nominating and Governance Committee. Sometimes other members on the board get involved at that stage in the process. Typically, we'll have a conversation with the CEO. We're trying to really understand what are the priorities in the new director, and how is that person going to fill the white space that exists on the board. So we determine the spec, we write the job spec. It's very similar to what the job spec would look like for an executive search. We talk about the process, and we essentially kick off the search. We then, phase 2 involves really trying to develop the list of great folks who check all the boxes and meet the criteria in the spec. And this is a pretty exhaustive and fairly systematic approach. Within a search firm context, we'll typically access talent from the executive placements we've made by our colleagues within the firm, as well as relationships that we've built from being in the business of working with top talent over the years. But we will also always look for new talent, and we will often create a search strategy to identify what are the kinds of companies that would have leaders at them who would be helpful and additive to our board, and get to know people that maybe we haven't placed before or haven't come across in a former executive search, but we want to get to know for the context of this search. All of that phase 2 activity leads to what we would describe as the long list, okay, of candidates for this particular search. A word about transparency or lack thereof, and this is the other big difference between this and an executive search. We may make a long list of candidates. There could be, 24 people on that list, and none of them may know that we are thinking about them for a specific board. We will likely have contacted them and talked to them about, are they interested in a board? If the board looked like this and it was in this part of the country, would they be interested? But at this point, we're really not disclosing who the company is, and there's a lot less transparency than you would have in a typical executive search. It's actually run more like a confidential CEO search would be run, okay? So anyway, we developed this list of interested candidates. At this point in the process, we may share with the candidate the meeting dates for the board, because one of the most important things to do is to make sure that a candidate doesn't have any conflicts for the scheduled meeting dates, because those can't be changed. So there are often times when someone would be a great fit for a board, but happens to serve on another board that meets at the exact same calendar times that this board meets, and therefore they would not be available. Phase 3, the assessment phase, we spend a lot of time sharing the backgrounds of the long list with the client. They will evaluate them further. There's a series of interviewing and referencing that goes on in phases 2 and 3, actually, to really get to know, is this person a good fit for our board, and do we think that they will really bring what we're hoping to bring onto the board? And at the end of that, there's a short list that evolves. The short list ultimately results in one candidate being selected as the finalist. An additional set of referencing occurs at that stage, and then finally an offer is made and someone is appointed to the board. That is the process, and then there's the onboarding and follow-up phase. Again, typically 3 to 4 months. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the tangible qualities that are sought in a director and the things that boards are looking for. And in addition to the specifics we've mentioned, someone who brings leadership and is a proven leader is often also desirable. But what we haven't really talked about, but I can't say enough about, are the intangibles, because these are really important in the ultimate determination of who gets selected to serve on the board. So even folks who've been incredibly successful CEOs and have exhibited tremendous leadership and grown a company from $100 million to $10 billion, they may not necessarily bring the intangibles that a specific board is looking for. And that's what happens in the interview and meeting process with the board directors. Their ability to assess, does this director fit on the intangibles with what we're looking for in our board? And I would say collaboration and the ability to be collegial is, ultimately what often makes the difference between someone who's selected and someone who isn't, because there's a concern that someone who's been a leader and been in charge of everything in their own company may not be able to make that transition to being a collaborator and a contributor. I see we're getting some questions. It says, do boards typically source with experience only from a certain type of company? For example, companies of a certain size or publicly traded. So I think the crux of that question is the word typically. With technology and what's happening with technology and the rapid pace at which things are changing in the world today, boards have become much more open-minded about the backgrounds and experiences that they're open to looking at than they may have been in the past. Yes, there is still value placed on, if we're a $200 billion company, someone who's run something of scale is probably a better fit for us than someone who's only been in a startup. But, again, if we're a $200 billion company and we're trying to instill more of a startup mentality in our business, maybe someone who had worked at one point in their career for a very large company and then gone on and done something entrepreneurial would be a good fit. Another question. What is the most important thing to highlight on my board CV? So people often ask me, do I need a separate board bio, board CV, from my sort of work experience resume? I think the answer is yes. I think it's good to have two documents. One is, the detail behind what you did in your executive roles. And for someone like me, I always want to have that because I do think the devil's in the details, and I really want to be able to understand what it is that you've done across the course of your career to get to where you are today. But I also think it's important to take the time to create a one-page board bio, which really articulates your value proposition to the board or to a board in general. And that's probably the most important thing to put on your CV. What is the value that you will bring to a board, and how should that board be thinking about you as it thinks about the kind of person it wants to bring on? Okay, I'm going to take a quick drink of water, and we'll go to the next slide. Okay, now we're getting really tactical at this point. What can you do? This is my, it's time for you to develop a game plan, because I really think you can potentially accelerate the opportunities for you to serve on a board by doing some specific things. First thing, educate yourself, okay? So you probably work in a company, or you probably know people who are CEOs or serve on boards. You should meet with them and ask them, how do you like being a board director? In what ways have you been able to contribute to your board? What's an example of the best director on your board, and why do you think that director creates so much value? You really want to understand what great looks like in the boardroom and decide, do you have what it takes to be great, or could you get there? So that's what I mean by educate yourself. And by the way, having those conversations would also enable you to learn a little bit more, not just learn about what's going on in the boardroom, but to start letting people know that you're interested in this, and maybe you would be interested in serving on a board at some point. Secondly, make sure your CEO and the board of your company know this is something that you're interested in doing and are supportive of you doing it, okay? So typically, again, as we showed in the slides earlier, there's a lot of people joining boards today who are not the CEOs of their own company. They may be 1 or 2 levels down. For them to actually go serve on the board of a public company, they're going to need approval from their CEO and their board to be able to do it. So if you're serious about this, you should talk to your CEO and board, particularly if you report directly to the CEO, and make sure that they are supportive and encouraging of your doing this. We talked about the 200 hours. This is going to take a lot of your time. They got to be on board with it, and they got to be supportive. And assuming they are, and by the way, increasingly, our clients on the executive side are interested in having their executives other than the CEO serve on boards, because they think it's an important part of their development to potentially become a CEO. So you need to just make sure that you've cleared those channels with your board and your CEO and make sure that they're supportive of you doing this. Next, the board bio, but the question already preempted this. You should take the time to articulate your board bio, to articulate your value proposition in a board bio that shows why you are unique and what you could do for this company or for a company that's looking for someone like you. The fourth point on here, I'm not sure everybody would agree with this, but I have the philosophy of, you know, if you can't see it, you can't be it. So you should take the time to create a target company list. Write down the list of companies that if they came knocking on your door and said, we really would love for you to serve on our board, you'd be delighted. Who's on that list? What are the kinds of companies that you think would excite you, that you would bring value to, as well as could serve on without conflict, right? If you work at Coke, you're not going to be able to serve on the Pepsi board. So you got to think through those things in advance and think about what would be compelling for you and actually write it down so you know what it looks like. Be realistic, okay? Somebody asked earlier the question about, you know, should I be open to joining the board of a smaller company? And again, I think the answer really is yes. If you are working in a company that's, you know, 100 million in revenue or 200 million in revenue, it would be highly unusual for a Fortune 500 company to be looking for you to join its board. But there are other boards that might be closer in size to the experiences you have that could be a great fit. They may not be as big names as the Fortune 500, but you could probably figure out who they are and start to think about those as options. Lastly, be patient. Timing really matters in this process, okay? I have met with people who have recently retired and want to serve on a board and are very anxious because now that they're retired, the serving on the board thing is the next thing and they're focused 100% on it and it's not happening. And they start to get frustrated 6 months in, a year in, oh, maybe I made a mistake, I shouldn't have retired, I wish I had done this differently. And what I will tell you is it almost always works out. It may take 2 years, it may take more, but the people I know who came back repeatedly and said, you know, what do I do? And essentially our conversations go back to this game plan and reiterating this game plan and continuing to network and meet with people, created opportunities for them. So there is this right time, right place aspect of this process that you have to get really comfortable with because you can't make the opportunity happen. Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground and we will soon be getting to the question and answer part of the webinar. But I did want to spend a little time talking about your due diligence or the opportunity set that we've sort of been floating around, but I wanted to make it a little bit more concrete. So essentially, the best board matches are when there's a win-win, when the board that you're looking to join could get a lot of value out of your experiences and you could gain a lot from serving on the board of that company. And that's what you got to keep in mind here is what am I bringing and what am I receiving? Because that's how they're thinking as well. And this is just a way to maybe think of some of the things you should be considering as you do your due diligence or thinking about a board opportunity. Okay, so if you have an opportunity to join the board of a company, here are some things you may want to consider. We've talked a little bit about time commitment, the 200 hours. Okay, we've talked about quality of the company, quality of the management team. I want to elaborate on that a little bit more. Think about it. It's 200 hours, okay? You gotta like the people you're gonna be spending time with. And by the way, it's 200 hours on average. Let's say there's a crisis at the company, happens, okay? Or an unplanned CEO succession. Those are circumstances where the amount of time, the frequency of meetings is going to go up. So you've gotta feel very confident that the other people in the room and the issues that this company is dealing with are ones that you're gonna be passionate and excited to deal with within the course of a crisis or the hundreds of hours over a given year. as well as one other dimension we didn't talk about, which is how long do people typically serve on boards? Well, most directors serve on boards between 8 to 10 years. So this is a big decision. You're not just making it for 1 year. You're likely going to be on this board through a CEO transition. Average CEO tenure is less than 6 years now. So you'll likely be there through a transition in the CEO. And you gotta like the other people in the room and feel confident that they're going to be making the right kinds of decisions because you are going to be grouped with them for a long period of time. Fit with skills and interests. Again, this goes to the win-win. Make sure that what you're interested in going forward aligns with the direction the company's going in. You may have spent your career in financial services, but you're really now interested at the intersection of technology with financial services. So finding a fintech company where you could bring your expertise from financial service into the board that's more active in technology could be a way to find that win-win. Question. Let's see. Can I give an example where I present a top-notch candidate and she is rejected for cultural misfit? Sure. I mean, this happens in all of our searches, and it doesn't matter if it's a he or a she. Cultural misfit, or the quote intangibles, is really a judgment call around chemistry, and the chemistry of the board directors typically first determined by the nominating governance committee because they're the first ones to meet the candidate, and then the candidate will meet other people on the board. But we do our best to understand the intangibles and the backgrounds of people that we think would fit well with the chemistry of the particular board, so that when we introduce a candidate, there's a high likelihood that the chemistry is going to be good. And frankly, the chemistry is typically good. It's just that the board has to make a choice. So if they're presented with 3 or 4 candidates that they meet, and they're only going to select one, they're going to pick the one they like the best or that fits the best with the board's culture, assuming everybody brings the relevant experiences. That's more the circumstance that evolves. Okay, couple other things. Let's see, opportunity cost. So remember, if you're an active exec, you really only have the time to do one corporate board, okay? So you gotta pick carefully, because once you choose it, you're there, as we said, for 8 to 10 years, and you're really not gonna be able to change it. So you gotta be thinking, if I join this board now, what does it mean for the other things that I'm foregoing as a result? Similarly, as I mentioned, there are quotas in European countries for women serving on boards, and as a result, a number of European companies have been reaching over the Atlantic to grab some great female talent to meet those quotas. And that's a very appealing construct for a lot of women who've been interested in serving on boards. And there's a lot of appeal to that, but you got to go into that with your eyes open. Some of these boards meet 8 or 9 times a year in the UK. Some meet in countries even harder to get to than London might be, depending on where you live. So you got to think about the amount of time you're going to be spending getting to a board that's, perhaps in a city farther from you, because that all weighs into opportunity costs. I have some candidates who live in New York City or the Bay Area, and they've essentially decided that their day job's so intense that they're only going to consider boards that are in New York City or in San Francisco. And I think that that's a fine way to think about this while you're still an executive, right? Your executive role is your primary job. So you want a board that you can work on and be effective with in the context of keeping your day job. And then lastly, remuneration. So what are directors typically paid? And then the answer is it varies. Typically, larger companies pay more than smaller companies. S&P 500 companies on average are paying more than $250,000 a year for a board director. That's typically paid half in cash, half in equity, and it's a retainer. So it's typically independent of the number of meetings. There is additional compensation paid if you happen to chair a committee, sometimes if you serve on a committee, but that's roughly the ballpark. For companies under $1 billion in revenue or smaller companies, compensation could be closer to $100,000 total. Okay, we have another question coming in. Let's see. Are nonprofit CEOs ever considered for for-profit boards? Yes. So the short answer to that question is yes. Let's see. Under what circumstances? I think what happens in the process is a sort of an assessment of what is this person who's the CEO of X, whether X is a nonprofit or a company, what have they been doing? Okay, what have they been leading? What's the scale of the organization? What is the complexity of the business? And are there aspects of that that are relevant to this other board? And if there's relevance, then I think that becomes a more compelling component than whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit. It doesn't necessarily substitute for a board that wants to bring another public company CEO onto its board, but I do think folks who are the CEOs of sizable organizations are appealing to other boards. Okay, another question. What are some strategies for recruiting people to join boards in education, for example, charter schools, et cetera? So we don't do a lot of, I personally don't do a lot of work recruiting people to serve on the boards of charter schools. We do have a nonprofit board practice that does a lot of work recruiting folks to serve on the boards of nonprofit organizations. And within there, maybe there's a charter school, although I don't know for sure. But essentially, I would expect the process to be similar. I do think with nonprofits, there is also an element of, is the individual passionate about the mission of this organization? And sometimes there's also an element of the ability to contribute financially to the nonprofit. Okay. What about those of us that are less experienced? Are there junior boards that we can join before getting onto a Fortune 500 board? Great question. So yes is the answer. As I showed you, there are 4,000 public companies in our sample, and there's even more. That means 3,500 below the Fortune 500 that are looking for board directors. And yes, I think those companies are very interested in bringing great and experienced executive talent onto their boards. And the opportunities there are going to be driven by your ability to network. It's less likely that the smaller companies may be using a search firm. But frankly, even if they are, again, there's no substitute for your networking. So if you know people who are leading companies that may have 50, 100 million in revenue and they have boards and you think you can contribute, those are the kinds of conversations you want to have so people know that this is something that you'd be interested in. Okay, another question. What is the best way to reach out to board-focused headhunters, particularly in Europe? Well, most large search firms have websites. You can find us. We're not that hidden. You can try reaching out directly. If you work at a company that has a search firm that's doing work for you on the executive side, that's often a nice way to get introduced into the board side recruiting of the search firm, because you already have a relationship or your company has a relationship with that search firm. That's another angle that I would suggest. How do activists who are getting more board representation recruit for board members? It's an important question. Any books or courses? I think that's a separate question. Okay, so let's talk about activists for a second. So what's happened is there are investors like State Street or CalPERS that we talked about, but then there are investors that are activists. So they are typically identifying companies that are performing poorly or underperforming by some metric that they have. They use a lot of data and analysis to determine what makes a company underperforming, and therefore a target for them to come in, own some stock, and then help the stock appreciate so that they can make a profit. And some activist shareholders have a long-term horizon, other activist shareholders have a short-term horizon. But typically, if an activist is getting involved, they have a point of view about what's happening in the company and probably think something needs to change. And they typically are having that conversation at the board level, right? We think that this business should no longer be owned by the company, or we think that this cost structure for this part of our business is too high. You guys need to take costs out of the system. So whatever it is, and they always have an investment thesis upon which they've made their investment, that, you know, if we changed X and Y, the company would perform better, the stock would go up. And they may therefore demand or try to get representation on the board. And depending on the percentage of the stock that they own and their efforts to negotiate, they may actually start to influence whether a new director coming onto the board is selected by them or selected by them in conjunction with the board. And that's essentially what happens with activists. Some of them will look for board directors on their own. Some of them will go to search firms and look using a search firm to find a qualified slate of directors that can actually make a difference in the boardroom. That's essentially that process. Okay, any books or courses that make sense to better prepare for board positions? So there are a lot of programs out there, many being sponsored by universities around the US and actually globally, to train people on corporate governance, what it takes to be a board member. And they typically could be a 2 to 3 day program that go through, you know, what are your fiduciary duties as a board member? What do you need to know if you're going to serve on an audit committee? How do you think about corporate strategy? How would you evaluate M&A if you're a board member? So that level of intense training is available at most business schools around the US, as well as, you know, there are other organizations that will do that type of training. There's a group called the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors, which hosts a national conference where board directors go and learn all of these things that are happening in the boardroom or with companies that board members should be sensitive and aware of. And they also have regional chapters. So in New England, it's called NACD of New England, and they host breakfasts on a monthly basis where they have speakers who talk about what are the issues most relevant to boards today and what are boards doing to address those issues. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in this, to connect into a community like NACD to be able to have access to the conversations that are going on about what's happening in governance. Okay, another question. Is there research on women's experience sitting on boards? I can imagine getting on a board as a woman is the first step, but what are the politics and hurdles involved? So yes, there is the research I had mentioned earlier that talks about the fact that boards who have brought on 3 or more women have those companies have outperformed financially boards with fewer women. And there are a number of articles that have been written about you know, how women have made that transition into the boardroom, found points of you know, commonality to be able to break barriers that may have historically been there. And yeah, there are a lot of people talking about this and thinking about it. There's probably a monthly article in the Wall Street Journal, if not more, on this topic. Any advice on social media presence and how voicing political or other opinions publicly may affect candidacy? You know, that's interesting. Political discourse is not a common part of a board search. And typically, boards are selecting folks based on their professional experience, not their political persuasion. So we focus a lot on what folks have been able to accomplish on a professional scale, build a business, open a new market, and that's really what the focus is. It's really not on political. Okay, so I wanted to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. Delighted that we were able to be together. Definitely want to thank the Harvard Alumni Association, Matthew Temple and Hauser Studios for the production of the webinar. I also wanted to mention 2 upcoming Harvard programs that are designed to train women specifically who are interested in serving on boards. One is Harvard Business School's Women on Boards program. It's called Succeeding as a Corporate Director. That will be held November 27th to December 1st of this year at Harvard Business School. And the Harvard School of Public Health has a program called Women on Boards, Getting On and Adding Value. And this is really targeted for women leaders in healthcare. And that will be held March 15th and 16th of 2018 at the School of Public Health. Thank you very much.